Hi everyone. I want to ask you a question. Do you fast? Do you think fasting is a godly discipline? How often do you fast? Do you fast once a year? Maybe twice a year? Tell me, what would you think of those people that fast twice a week? They must be some next level Christians, huh? Okay, how about tithing? Do you think tithing is a godly discipline? Okay, do you tithe? Or when you tithe, do you like tithe on your whole income or only on your income after tax? So what would you think of people that tithe on everything they have? I mean, that must be some anointed prophet or apostle there. How about praying? Do you love to pray? Do you pray long? Do you pray regularly? Do you attend all your church prayer meetings? Okay. And what would you think of those people that do love to pray, that do pray long prayers, that you do see at every church prayer meeting? I mean, those people must be God's delight, isn't it? Well, what's interesting, Jesus actually knew some people exactly like that. And you know what? In Luke 18, he tells us of a man who fasts twice a week and he gives tithes of all that he has. And yet after one of these prayer meetings, when he leaves the prayer meeting, he still lives in his sins. When Jesus teaches in Matthew 6 on fasting and prayer, he calls those people that love to pray, that pray long prayers. He doesn't call them holy. He calls them heathen, or some of them at least, heathen or hypocrites. And friends, so the question is why? Why, if these people are doing godly things, does God not necessarily have a good view of them? Well, the reason is because God sees in secret. You know, you and I, we can only see what's in front of our eyes, what our eyes can perceive, but God sees in secret. And appearances can be deceiving, but God sees in secret. Now, we are going to, for the next couple of weeks, journey through the passage in Isaiah 58, where God himself teaches us on the fast that he had chosen. And my task in this video is to give you an overview and a background of this specific passage. And I've entitled it, Appearances Can Be Deceiving, because that's exactly what you encounter in Isaiah 58. Now, to start off, let me tell you a little bit of Isaiah himself. Isaiah is the quintessential oracle. Now, oracle is someone whose prophecies was preserved in the scriptures. So Isaiah starts his prophecies with the time span over which he had prophesied. And his prophecies spanned over 4 kings, the rulership of 4 kings. That's over Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That makes his prophetic ministry more than 60 years long. Now, you might have recalled that the nation of Israel was split into 2. They had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the northern kingdom was called the kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And it was during this time of separation between these 2 nations that Isaiah prophesied. But he prophesied to both of these nations. Now, what's interesting about the 4 kings that spanned over which his prophecy spanned, 3 of these kings were actually godly kings. Very interesting. I mean, Uzziah, the scripture says of Uzziah, he did that which is right in the sight of God. Of Jotham, it says he did that which was right in the sight of God. But then of Ahaz, it says he did not do that which was right in the sight of God, as David his father did. But then of Hezekiah, the king that was ruling during the time that Isaiah 58 was prophesied, listen to this commendation given to him. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor ever that were before him. For he clave to the Lord, and he departed not from following him, but he kept his commandments, which the Lord commanded Moses. So Hezekiah was a reforming ruler. After his evil father Ahaz, he reopened the temple and he reinstituted the temple practices such as sacrificing according to the law of Moses and the praise and worship that David had instituted. Now, the Levites and priests were eager and diligent at obeying their king's commands, and the people of the nation rejoiced. Now, after he had opened the temple, he then restored the Passover. And so for the first time in more than 100 years, they celebrated the Passover exactly according to the prescriptions in the law. One of the things, for example, is that all 12 tribes participated in this Passover, something that hadn't happened since the time of Solomon. Now, even those tribes that didn't purify themselves for the Passover was allowed to participate. What Hezekiah just did is he prayed for them. And after he prayed for them, God healed them. So this is what the Bible says about after this. In 2 Chronicles 30 verse 25 to 26, it says, "And all the congregation of Judah with the priests and the Levites and all the congregation that came out of Israel," okay, the northern kingdom, "and the strangers that came out of the land of Israel, even the foreigners that were among the Jewish people, all that dwelt in Judah rejoiced, so that there were great joy in Jerusalem. For since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there was not the like in Jerusalem." So this was a time of great revival, these initial years of Hezekiah. And then after this, Hezekiah went and he reinstituted the offices of the priests and the Levites. And he encouraged the people, the nation, to give towards the provision of the Levites. Now the nation responded with such eagerness, such zeal, such generosity, that when he eventually came to see what they brought, there wasn't enough space to contain all the provisions that they had brought. And so he commanded them to build these storehouses to contain these provisions. And you know those storehouses that in Malachi, it says, "Bring your tithe into the storehouse"? It was those storehouses that Hezekiah built. Now listen to how his story ends in 2 Chronicles 31, this commendation. "And thus did Hezekiah throughout all Judah, and he wrought that which was good and right and truth before the Lord his God. And every work which he began in the service of the house of God, in the law and in the commandments, to seek his God, he did with all his heart, and he prospered." Wow, wouldn't you love to live under a king like that? This nation did. Isaiah did. He was a prophet during this age. And there was revival in the land. For many years, the people responded faithfully in obedience and sought their God. As a matter of fact, read Isaiah 58 verse 2. "They seek me daily. They delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness and that forsook not the ordinances of their God. They ask of me the ordinance of justice. They take delight in approaching God." So friends, this is what it appeared like. For anyone that was looking at this nation, they seemed like a nation that was seeking after God. But appearances can be deceiving. It was not what God was seeing when he was looking at the nation. Yes, his assessment of Hezekiah was that he did everything with all his heart. But let's look at Isaiah 58 verse 1. "Cry aloud, spare not. Lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. For yet they seek me daily. They delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness, and that forsook not the ordinances of their God. They ask of me the ordinances of justice. They take delight in approaching to their God." So when you look at this nation, God's assessment is what you are going to see is you see a people that seek him daily, that delight to know his ways, that a nation that did righteousness, that seek after his ordinances, that ask for the ordinance of justice, that delight in approaching God. That's what you see. But then when the people respond, they say in verse 3, "Wherefore have we fasted?" They say, "and thou seest it not. Wherefore have we afflicted our souls, and thou takest no knowledge of it?" So clearly this nation has returned to God in their devotion. And through the leadership of this really godly King Hezekiah, they were led to follow these ordinances. And they set themselves apart for God, and they were diligent in practicing what was in the law. And in those initial days, at that first Passover, for example, God did see their heart. He did see their contriteness. As a matter of fact, right after that Passover, the priests and the Levites arose. They blessed the people, and their voices was heard, and their prayer came up to his holy dwelling, even unto heaven. And yet, now the people complain. We fasted, and thou seest it not. We've afflicted our souls, and thou takes no knowledge of it. So friends, why? Why did God change his favor towards them? If they were doing the same things that they had done from the beginning. Well, I'll tell you why. Because God tells them why. He tells them in verse 4, Behold, in the day that you fast, you find pleasure. You exact all your labor. Behold, you fast for strife and debate, and to smite with the fist of wickedness. You shall not fast as you fast on this day, and make your voice heard on high. So, what is going on here? Why is this nation doing the same thing, and yet God sees something different? Now, we've looked at the historical context, and that this is happening at a time where there is indeed revival in Israel. And yet, what we've not looked at yet is the biblical context. So we've seen the historical context. Let's look at the biblical context. What is this fast that is being talked about here? What is God's expectation of fasting? Now, what's very interesting is when a Hebrew person reads through this, he immediately knows what the context of this fast is, because there is only one prescribed fast for the Jews. Okay. In the law, there's only one prescribed fast, and that fast is associated with the ordinance of justice, the Day of Atonement. And the word atonement means at one mend, atonement, at one mend. The Hebrew word means to fill up something that is separated, or two things that are distinct, to fill up the gap between them and to cover it so that it's one piece. So, for example, the first time it's used in the Bible is actually very appropriate. It's when Noah paints the ark. The word used for the pitch that he uses is the same word that's translated as atonement. Now, the pitch is used to make of two planks to fill up the gap in between and to cover them to be one piece so that no water can seep through. And this is the concept of atonement. Atonement is the idea that sin has separated God and his people. And to make atonement is to fill up that gap and to cover the sins so that God and his people can be one. So on this day, the Day of Atonement, the day celebrating God's justice, the nation had to come together in a holy convocation. That means a holy gathering before their high priest. And then they would bring 2 goats before the high priest. One was to be a sin offering, and the other goat was called the scapegoat. Now, the scapegoat was brought to the high priest, and then Leviticus 16 verse 21 to 22 tells us what the high priest does with the scapegoat. It says, he shall lay his hands on the head of the live goat, and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel, and all their transgression, and all their sins, putting them up on the head of the goat. And he shall send him away into the land by the hand of a fit man into the wilderness, and the goat shall bear upon him the iniquities unto a land not inhabited, and he shall let go the goat in the wilderness. So friends, this was the ordinance of justice, the day commemorating the justice of God, who in no wise will ignore sin when he forgives it. No, the punishment of sin is death and separation from God. And in the Old Covenant, this punishment was poured out on these innocent animals. Now, this Day of Atonement was the only day where there was a prescribed fast for the nation of God. And it was not just a fast day, it was also a Sabbath day. if we read Leviticus 16, verse 23 to 32, it shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest. You shall afflict your souls. Now, the concept of afflicting your soul or to chasten your soul is an Old Testament way of saying humbling yourself through fasting. So you shall afflict your souls in the 9th day of the month, that's the 10th month, at evening, from evening unto evening, you shall celebrate your fast. So what is interesting, of all the days, the Sabbath days, the commemorative days that God instructed his people to celebrate, they all were accompanied with feasts and meals. So think, for example, of the Passover meal that Jesus ate with his disciple. But then you also get the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths. All of them were associated with food and feasting except for the Day of Atonement. It was not a celebration. The day was not a celebration, but it was a Sabbath of rest to afflict your souls. Clearly, it was a day in which the nation had to spend contemplating the injustice that was done to these innocent animals as a consequence of the nation's sins. It was a day of remorse and repentance where you could extend the forgiveness that God had now given to you to others. But it was also a day of rest, a day where we rest, where the nation had to rest from their self-efforts to be right with God, simply to trust in the sufficiency of the sacrifice, in the ability of the mediator to accomplish this work, the high priest to accomplish this work, and then also in the justice of God, that he would be righteous and indeed do what he said he would. Now, Isaiah 58, there's a few clues in Isaiah 58 that tells us that this is exactly the context of this fast that God is speaking about. First of all, verse 2 talks about, they ask of me the ordinance of justice, and that is the Day of Atonement. In verse 2 also talks about this delight that the people have in approaching God. Now, you can only have delight in approaching God if you have been atoned, if you've made one, if you've been reconciled. Okay. Then also verse 3 and verse 5 talks about afflicting your soul. Now, the only place in the Jewish law where the idea of afflicting your soul appears is in the context of the Day of Atonement. Now, passage 3 also suggests that it is a specific fast, okay? And the only specific fast in the Jewish scriptures was the Day of Atonement. It also tells us that this is the fast that God had chosen. And again, the only fast that has been prescribed by God is the fast on the Day of Atonement. Now, furthermore, the fast in Isaiah 58 that's being talked about is associated with a Sabbath rest. And the only place in the Jewish scriptures where Sabbath rest and fasting is together is in the prescriptions of the Day of Atonement. And so there's no doubt that this specific context of Isaiah 58 is for the Day of Atonement, the day in which people are brought together with their God, the day in which they are made one with their God Most High. And yet, instead, Isaiah says that the people complain. They say, we have fasted, and thou seest not. We have afflicted our soul, and thou hast taken no knowledge. So outwardly, you can see their devotion. Outwardly, they seem to appear contrite, sincere, fervent if you look at their actions, their fasting, but they are all too aware that God did not see their fasting because he took no knowledge of it. Because they are all too aware that God sees something else. God sees in secret. And so verse 4 starts like this. Behold, behold, in other words, look, see what I see. Behold, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure, and you exact all your labors. So in this day, in the day when they should be afflicting their souls, interrogating their hearts, and contemplating the weight of their sin and separation from God, beating on their breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Instead, they find pleasure in afflicting their souls. Jesus says that some people, when they fast, they actually find a pleasure in fasting. Why? Because of their appearance, the way that they look when they fast. They even get a reward, the satisfaction of the recognition they get from others that see their piousness and their virtue. They find pleasure in afflicting their souls. Why? Because of the way it appears to other people. Secondly, and you exact all your labors. That's the second complaint that God is posting to them. You exact all your labors. Now, no doubt, there's two meanings to this. Firstly, they neglected the full observance of this fast, because this fast day, the Day of Atonement, was supposed to be fasting with a fast and with a Sabbath. But they exacted all their labors. So instead of it being a fast, being a day wholly commemorated to seek God and his righteousness, instead they kept themselves busy and distracted with pleasures and with work, and so that they can quickly get to the end of the day and say, see, I fasted. See, I fasted. Did you see that, God? Other people saw it. I fasted. No. You know what? Sometimes I get so busy at work that I don't even think of food. I forget to eat because I'm so busy. So if not eating is fasting, then I fast twice a week. Okay, but then there's a deeper meaning and another meaning. Listen to this. If in the day when they fast and their contemplation should be demonstrating to them their utter inability to make atonement for themselves, they need a sacrifice. This is what this day is about, is contemplating that we need a sacrifice. And we need a mediator. And we need a scapegoat. Okay? And we need a God who will be just and accept such an ordinance so that we can be reconciled to him. In that day, when their hunger should actually be a demonstration for them of their utter need for God, in that day, they exact all their labor. They use the very devotion, fasting, that should serve to show them their poverty. They use that even as more self-righteousness to force God to do them good. I mean, look at what they say. We have fasted, and thou seest not. We've afflicted our souls, and thou takes no knowledge of it. It's just like that parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 18 about the man that prayed, and the Pharisee that prayed, and the sinner that prayed. And then he says in verse 9 that he told this parable to those people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they despised others. And then he basically says that when the Pharisee prays, he says, I am not like other sinners because I fast twice a week and I give tithes of all that I have. So friends, do you agree with me that this is not the fast that God had chosen? This is not his the idea behind his holy day of atonement. Do you agree with me that with God's unwillingness to answer from on high? It makes sense, why not? So let's interrogate our hearts and our fasting. If we do fast. When we fast, do we find pleasure in our fasting? Do we find pleasure in our piousness because other people see us fasting? Or do we distract ourselves with work and other pleasures so that we can get to the end of the day and say, okay, at least I fasted today, God will do me good? Or do we trust in our fasting labor? Do we think that because we fast, we are not like other sinners? It applies to us too, doesn't it? But God continues his assessment of them. Behold, you fast for strife and debate, and to smite with a fist of wickedness. Behold, you fast for strife and debate, and to smite with a fist of wickedness. Again, no doubt there's a double meaning here. For one, you know that irritation and agitation you get when you're hungry? It wears thin those cords that hold back your wrath at the best of times. We call it hangry. Angry because I'm hungry. But it's probably rather hanger. Anger revealed by hunger. You see, the flesh is weak, and every self-effort that we use to contain our emotions is now occupied with convincing the body that it is going to die, get food. So the anger, the irritability, the debate, the strife, the striking with the fist of wickedness, these things are not a consequence of being hungry. They are the true state of our hearts. It's just kept contained by self-control that's covered up with our pious practices. But when the flesh is weak through fasting, oh, then the true nature is revealed. And that is as true today as it was back in ancient times. So no doubt us saying things like, well, excuse my irritation, I'm just hangry, that's just self-justification. Because the truth is, I'm just angry. And hunger now exposes that. So no doubt that is one of the meanings you fast for strife and debate and to smite with a fist of wickedness. But there's another meaning, no doubt. No doubt. Do you remember when John's disciples came to Jesus and they asked him, why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples fast not? It's interesting, isn't it? There's this natural tendency for us to compare our fasting to those of others, our devotion to others' devotion, judging how long and what it should look like compared to others. You see, the whole point of fasting is to afflict your soul, to humble yourself before God. And yet it's during this time of fasting that our pride is most stirred, and it finds its expression in comparing ourselves to others and debating how and when and what fasting should be. Now friends, this wasn't a new thing in Jesus' time when John's disciples came and compared themselves to Jesus's. It wasn't new then, and it isn't new today, and it wasn't an odd thing in this time of religious revival in Israel. You know, for me, this is one of the most challenging things, not to compare myself with other people, especially when I fast. But God says, you shall not fast as you do this day, to make your voice heard on high. That's not the type of fast that God has chosen. That's not the type of fast that will make him speak from on high to us. It's not the fast that looks contrite, that looks sincere, that appears to be correct, because appearances can be deceiving. So, what is the fast that he has chosen? What is the heart that should be behind fasting? What should fasting not be? But also, what should fasting be? Well, if you have those questions, wonderful. Because you can tune into the next videos that will be coming out once every week and learn about what is God's heart for fasting. God bless you.